Welcome, everyone. Thanks for coming out today. I'm Walter Lohman, Director of our Asian Studies Center here at the Heritage Foundation. With all that's going on in U.S.-China relations today, especially on the econ side, all of the tension, the talk of decoupling our economies, all the geostrategic issues, the problems we have in South China Sea, Taiwan, elsewhere, I'm afraid that actually the state of religious freedom in China gets overlooked in Washington. For some big thinkers, I think, some big foreign policy thinkers, actually, that's probably not an oversight. Some of our friends, people who are concerned mostly with those big geopolitical issues, the U.S. position in the Pacific, the Quad dialogue, all these sorts of things, I think they see religious freedom issues as impediments to real clear-headed thinking on geopolitics, things that they think statesmen should be most concerned about. They care about hard power. They're not focused on churches being shuttered in China. They're not focused on churches being bulldozed or the concentration camps in Xinjiang or the situation in Tibet, except to the extent that they are part of a big power game. For some other observers, I think they're just not looking closely enough if they don't see problems with religious liberty in China. So today we've brought together representatives of each important community, the Christian community, Tibetan representatives of the Tibetan communities and Uyghur community, to give us a perspective on what's going on in China with regard to religious liberty. First is Dr. Bob Fu. Bob is president and founder of China Aid, a Christian human rights organization committed to the religious freedom of all in China. I think that's important for all of these groups, that it's very true that unless religious communities stick together, even of different faiths and denominations, that they will all be attacked separately. So I think it's very important to recognize that China Aid cares about religious freedom of all, although they work closely with the Christian community. Bob was born and raised in China. He was a student leader during the Tiananmen Square demonstrations in 1989. He was also a house church leader in Beijing until he and his wife were imprisoned for illegal evangelism in 1996. A lot of things I could tell you about Bob, but it would take too long, so I'm going to stop. Next, we'll turn to Dr. Sen-Hung Yang, who's president and founder of the Taiwan Association for China Human Rights. I know a lot less about Sen-Hung, but he's a friend of Bob's, and any friend of Bob's is a friend of mine. So we're very glad to have you here, and look forward to your remarks. Then we'll turn to Nuri Turkle. Nuri, I've actually have known for many years. Among other things, he was instrumental in getting Rebbe Kadir to a heritage stage several years ago. Today, Nuri is chairman of the Uyghur Human Rights Project, a research, reporting, and advocacy nonprofit organization founded by the Uyghur American Association with the support of the National Endowment for Democracy. And finally, Matteo Macacci. Matteo is yet another very good friend of the Heritage Foundation. We find ourselves working together and consulting quite a bit. Matteo is president of the International Campaign for Tibet, and everyone knows what that is. Right? So your fame precedes you, I think, the International Campaign for Tibet. So with that, let me turn it over to Bob. He'll get us started. We'll go through maybe 10 minutes from each and hopefully then generate some conversation with the audience. Thank you very much. Bob?
Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Lohman. I really want to thank the Heritage Foundation for convening this important conference in light of the deteriorating situation in China. Really, in 2018, not only marked the worst year for religious freedom in China in 40 years, but also other human rights indexes, such as freedom of press, freedom of assembly, certainly the freedom of association. There are so many reports already. And today, I'm so honored and very glad also to be on the same platform with my close friends, Dr. Yang, my friend Nori, and Matteo, that we are in total solidarity. So we want to tell the persecutors, the Chinese regime, that to attack and persecute one group is attack to every one of us. No matter it's persecution against Protestant Christians, to Catholic Christians, to our Tibetan friends, our Uyghur Muslim friends, our Falun Gong, and whoever is persecuted for their faith or belief is the enemy of religious freedom. I hope we all agree on this, and we all kind of united in not only opposing the religious persecution by the Chinese regime, but also stand united to uphold, advance religious freedom for all, including the atheists, the Communist Party members, because one of the big features in 2018 is if you go to either a mosque or government-sanctioned so-called patriotic movement churches, around the church building, every piece of the wall, and even toward the church building, you will see the signs that 5 forbidden policies. On the poster is listed like those following 5 groups of people are not allowed to enter into a church, a synagogue, or a temple. These 5, like children under 18 years old, the students, the Communist Party members, the military members, the members of civil, working as civil servants. So these are the people are singled out, not even allowed to have a basic fundamental rights which is guaranteed in the Article 36 of the Communist Party's own constitution, which says the citizens of China is guaranteed for freedom of religious belief. So if this group of people, I mean, these 5, I think, constitute at least 20% of China's population, they're not only, they're not even allowed to exercise their basic, freedom of religious belief. For the sake of time, I will focus primarily on the persecution against Christian faith in 2018, and I certainly am looking forward to our other friends who will talk about the atrocity of internment camps, the reeducation camps of these 1 to 3 million Uyghur friends in Xinjiang. Of course, the grave persecution continues against the Tibetan Buddhists. In 2018, we have documented over 10,000 persecution cases against Christians, which is 36 times greater than those recorded in 2017. And by the way, if you get a copy of our annual persecution report, this is in page 20. And in 2018, there are more than 2,000 abuse cases, including physical, verbal, mental abuse, and torture. It involves 50,000 Christians. We have their names that we documented every case. I mean, this is, of course, not representing the whole China. The persecution against all Christians is only the tip of the iceberg. So this is, the 50,000 members who were tortured physically and mentally against these Christians. That includes, December 9th, when the authorities had simultaneously attacked this one of the largest house churches in Chengdu, Sichuan province, the Early Rain Covenant Church. I mean, children, women, including pregnant women, were being dragged miles to the police station and lost her baby. So I call that baby as really the first youngest martyr of the year 2018. So this has been happening not only in one location, one area, or just to the so-called house church or independent unregistered churches. This is happening to actually in the most massive way to the government-sanctioned, legally registered, supposedly Communist Party protected, the three self-patriotic movement churches. In fact, on February the 1st, the first day when the Xi Jinping's new regulation on religious affairs took effect, but we published this journal called Chinese Law and Religion Monitor, and documented scholarly analysis of what's the effect of that new regulation on religious affairs. You're welcome to grab a copy. It shows that in the name of that new regulation, the first day, we have received credible reports in Henan province alone, over 10,000 churches, government-sanctioned churches, were forcefully shut down. 10,000. That's government-sanctioned churches. One county called Xiayi County, 200 government-sanctioned churches. In that one county, only 3 are left to be, to legally allowed to continue to exist. 197 were totally shut down. That's only, one county out of so many hundreds of counties in Henan province alone. And then to the independent house churches, beginning in October, the target was the largest house church in Beijing called Zion, Beijing Zion Church, led by Pastor Ezra Jin Mingzhi. And the whole church, 1,500 members. There's main sanctuary, and there's 6 branches in different districts were all attacked. Of course, it was triggered when the Chinese securities demands the face recognition cameras to be installed on the pulpit in order to monitor who are these members are attending the church, whether there are any children, any Communist Party member, any civil servants, those 5 kind of types of groups. So that's one feature. So 2018 also represent the worst persecution in terms of for the first time since 1967, that under the communist rule, that Bibles were being collected and put on the public road, square, and being burned. Bibles and Christian books were being burned. The last time that happened was in Shanghai in 1967, 1 year after the Cultural Revolution, that Chairman Mao's wife, Madam Jiang Qing, organized a big Bible burning kind of a ceremony with hundreds of thousands of copies of Bible were being burned. And of course, we have seen another record in 2018 that the central government sent religious regulation inspection teams to go to different churches to so-called inspect their compliance of this new slogan called Sinicization, 中国化. So the Sinicization is not only aiming to the Christian religion, but to the Tibetan Buddhists, to the Uyghurs, Muslims, all faiths. Basically, Sinicization. What is a Sinicization? The closest term, I did a little historical research, is 1930s when the Nazi Germany put the Nazi logos on the pulpit, basically called Nazification. So if you want to, think one thing you can take away is when somebody asks you, what is the Sinicization, or 中国化, 基督教中国化, 宗教中国化, you can see the closest comparison is Nazification. We were seeing in the government-sanctioned church, they took down the portrait of Jesus and any other kind of a real religious signs, and instead they install the portrait of Chairman Mao and Chairman Xi Jinping. And with the national flag, and on the formal church service program, item number 1, instead of the the benediction or using the prayer, number 1 is the congregation is mandated to rise up and sing the national anthem and singing praises of the Communist Party. And we just received one photo this morning that the believers sent to me, said they were asked to put the 春节对联, the Chinese New Year, the kind of blessing, sorry for the English term, 对联, so, was, anyway, it's a tradition, during the Chinese New Year, you put this on the 2 sides of your door. And instead of, the blessings, you said on the one side is, give thanks to Chairman Xi for getting out of poverty. The other one is thanks to the Communist Party for being rich. Well, that was Christian homes are forced to put these signs there. And you have the local church was asked to even have an office set up for the local Communist Party leaders, from village party chief to the county party official, to have an office for the local Communist Party leaders. So on Sunday, the party leader name was formally listed on the church worship bulletin. So after the pastor's sermon, the party leader would do sermon section 2 or part 2 to purify the so-called the sermons. So these are just one. Again, it's kind of the tip of the iceberg. I just gave these examples, but shows that the whole, I think, the condition of religious freedom and, of course, rule of law has entered into the worst time again. Perhaps somebody said, okay, so since the end of Cultural Revolution, maybe it's even worse in some aspects. So I want to stop from here and have our second speaker.
Okay, terrific. I have a lot of questions for you, but I'm going to hold on to Dr. Young, please.
Thank you, Dr. Lohman. It's good. Yeah. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm really happy to have the chance to speak here because that is a very important moment. Taiwan is a very unique country in the world. The life in this beautiful island is never easy. The military threatening outside from China has been lasting for more than 60 years. Inside, there was also a difficult history for Chinese people to struggle against the persecutions from the authoritarian rulers between 1945 to 1987. Today, we are discussing religious freedom in China. As Mr. Bapu has just talked about, I would like to extend the concern to how it affects the interaction in the midst of the U.S., Taiwan, and China. Therefore, my topic today is from price to value, from profit to justice, how the history will see the U.S., Taiwan, and China relationship. History is something I think we must keep in mind. I would like to mention that the evolution of Taiwan in 1980s to remind us how things were changed when the value of human rights was put on the highest place inside our hearts. China has become a strong economic entity by following the footsteps of Taiwan, producing mostly that what Taiwan used to produce. However, in the goal of religious freedom and human rights, it is still way behind. Many people talk about Taiwan experience as a good example for developing country to follow. This should not be limited to the growth of the economy, but also the reform of political and judicial system. Taiwan is a free country now, but it was achieved by the peoples tirelessly fighting for their freedom back in the 1980s. Taiwan used to be like China now. For about 40 years, Taiwan was ruled under martial law that was eventually lifted in 1987. There were persecutions based on many ridiculous reasons among before the 美丽岛事件, the 美丽岛 incident in 1979, there was the white terror suppression on the political distance. Less publicized were the leveling of a certain branch of Taoism and denomination of Christian as cults and the imprisonment of the followers. That was basically not different from now Christian and the Buddhist and the Muslims have been treated in China these days. Through the effort of many freedom fighters, the government could no longer stop the tide of the democratization in Taiwan. The similar words of accusation have been used by the rulers in the past Taiwan and now China, such as inciting, sabotage, and conspiring to violently overthrow the state, undermining the community's peace and stability, the dangers of desiring to cause subversive. Nowadays, these descriptions have appeared in the political sentence in China frequently. The political sentence of Liu Xiaopo was a lesson to Chinese, especially when he was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. The communist China tyrannically refused the world recognition to the writer who had been in jail for 11 years sentenced with the charge of inciting to overthrow the state power, while the so-called evidence was just only a draft of a new constitution. And then he had been killed by so-called liver cancer. Taiwanese people felt very hard to endure the ridiculous result. Last 2 years, the Taiwanese human rights activist Li Mingze was kidnapped, arrested, and had been tortured in China jail for 5 years sentence with the charge of also the same name, inciting to overthrow the state power without any evidence. Today we have his wife, Li Jingyu, together with us here. Can you just say hello to us? Yes, thank you very much. Chinese people felt angry. Suppression has been not only against the individual of Taiwanese, but the whole state of Taiwan. The remarks delivered by Vice President Mike Pence on the administration's policy towards China at the Hudson Institute on October 4th, 2018, he mentioned Taiwan strongly his state. Since last year, that's 2017, the Chinese Communist Party has convinced Latin American nations to sever ties with Taipei and recognize Beijing. These actions threaten the stability of the Taiwan Strait, and the United States of America condemns these nations. America will always believe Taiwan's embrace of democracy shows a better path for the Chinese people. But today, China has built an unparalleled surveillance state, and when it comes to religious freedom, a new wave of persecution is crashing down on Chinese Christians, Buddhists, and Muslims. Across the country, authorities are tearing down the crosses, burning Bibles, and imprisoning believers Beijing is also cracking down on Buddhism. Over the past decade, more than 150 Tibetan Buddhist monks had lit themselves on fire to protest China's repression of their beliefs and culture. And in Xinjiang, the Communist Party has imprisoned as many as 1 million Muslim Uyghurs in government camps. There they endure around-the-clock brainwashing. Survivors of the camps have described their experience as the deliberate attempt by Beijing to strangle the Uyghur culture and stamp out the Muslim faith. The speech of the Vice President Mike Pence gave us a very clear picture of the evil empire. He has talked something we have experienced almost daily in Taiwan. Taiwan will never accept a one country, two systems framework, said our President Tsai Ing-wen in the beginning of the 2019. The majority of Taiwan public opinion resolutely opposed the one country, two systems, he concluded. That is the Taiwan consensus. It was a response to the January 2nd talk. Chairman Xi Jinping said China will try to achieve peaceful reunification with one country, two system framework to Taiwan, but will not renounce the use of force to resolve the cross-strait disputes. What is Taiwan consensus? It is like what Vice President Mike Pence has mentioned. The United States wants Beijing to pursue trade policy that are free, fair, and reciprocal. Free, fair, and reciprocal, that's very important. But sadly, China's rulers have refused to take that path so far. Vice President Mike Pence said, as I said before, Beijing is employing a whole of government approach to advance its influence and benefit its interest. It's employing this power in more proactive and coercive way to interfere in the domestic policies and the politics of the United States. The Chinese Communist Party is rewarding or coercing American business, movie studios, universities, think tanks, scholars, journalists, and local, state, and federal officers. Worst of all, China has initiated an unprecedented effort to influence American public opinion. The 2018 election and the environment leading into the 2020 presidential elections. To put it bluntly, President Trump's leadership is working, and China wants a different American president. Taiwan felt the same threat, just like the points have been delivered by the Vice President Pence. Taiwan Association of China Human Rights, I am the president. This is a non-governmental organization in Taiwan, and our association goal is to urge the government of Taiwan to pay attention to the current situation of the human rights, especially religious freedom in People's Republic of China. We believe now is the time we have to take action, not just only talk all the talks. And the issue of religious freedom, mostly important thing is to let the people in China, especially Christian, could have chance to do worship and to listen sermon through the traditional technology of the short wave and the middle wave broadcasting. When the evil empire disconnect the internet, the people need transistor to connect the outside world. I believe this. This is a very special occasion which brings us all together to see the light at the end of the tunnel. after struggling against the problem of freedom suppression in China for many years. I'd like to say not only the facts we discussed today will be part of the history, the meeting itself and all participants here are already in the historic moment. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Young. I think you raise an important question about what action we can take. We need to take action. So maybe in the discussion we can get into that. One thing I hope we don't get into too much is trade policy, because I think we should focus on the things that bring us all together here, which is concern for religious freedom. I think if you start moving into trade policy, we're at Heritage we're not thrilled with the tariffs on China and this sort of aggressive approach, unilateral approach, et cetera. So then when we start talking about that, we start losing our unity here. It also occurred to me that, when we talk about the camps now, the Uyghurs are contained in, obvious parallels immediate come to mind with Nazi Germany. And, unfortunately, Nazi Germany is such a big image, it's such a huge sort of weight that hangs over history that's almost impossible to compare anything to it. And in fact, anytime you compare something to it, you almost lose ground because it doesn't sound possible. But I think that's partly because we think of Nazi Germany as we came to understand it fully in 1945. We don't think about what it was in 1935. And so if we can think back to 1935 and how the concentration camps in Germany and how what purpose they served and the scale that they were at, it's a little bit more digestible, I think, for us. So with that, I just wanted to segue to Nuri's remarks, because he, I think, can shed some light precisely on the nature of what's going on in Xinjiang.
Good morning. Thank you, Walter. Thank you, Heritage Foundation, for allowing me to be part of this important discussion. The Uyghur situation has deteriorated rapidly since early 2017. That is, it has taken some time for the international community to begin to understand the scale and magnitude of what is happening. There has been crackdown, as we all know, since Xi Jinping took office in 2013. But what is happening in East Turkestan, or Xinjiang, if you will, has invited comparison to pretty much all of the ugly chapters or regrettable chapters in the history book. The Chinese state, what is Chinese government's problem with Uyghur Islam? Chinese state sees Uyghur identity as a threat to their control of the region, and religious belief is an important aspect of that identity. They also see Uyghurs' ethno-national identity as a source of future political threat. At the same time, they see Uyghur Islam as something disloyal to Communist Party. With that mindset, the Chinese government Chinese leadership, especially the current leadership, have determined to stamp out the Uyghur identity entirely. This sentiment has been expressed by the U.S. government in various occasions, namely in October in Vice President Mike Pence's speech at Hudson Institute. With the recent government reorganization in China, the United Workfront Department observed ministries for religious and ethnic affairs, creating more direct government control over the implementation of policy. At the national level, the government has instituted a Sinification of religion campaign targeted for the increasing government control of religion, adding a new assimilative element aimed at adding Chinese culture feature to religious practices, especially foreign religion, quote-unquote foreign religions such as Islam and Christianity. This will have a particularly negative effect on the Uyghurs because their traditional religious practices historically don't have a Chinese influence. People who have been recently traveled to East Turkestan report that neighborhood mosque has been closed. The domes and crescent star have been removed from mosques, and Quranic passages have been replaced by CCP, or Communist Party propaganda place cards. The Chinese authorities are attacking Uyghur cultural practices, interfering in traditions such as wedding, funerals, banning certain Muslim names, increasing the confiscation of Quran, religious books and items, and trying to pressure Uyghurs into participating in Chinese traditional holidays, such as the Spring Festival or New Year, which is today happened to be. The detainment of as many as 2 million Uyghurs, as noted by the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State Scott Busby in December, in the internment camps began in the spring of 2017, and is the most extreme manifestation of the security crackdown and ideological campaigns that are affecting the lives of Uyghurs both inside and outside of the camps. There has been massive buildup of high-tech security forces, turning Uyghurs' homeland into a police state, as well as assigning CCP officials to stay in homes under this program called Homestay to monitor the Uyghur family members' interactions and daily routine activities. Imagine that you have a group of uninvited guests wanted to sit with you on your dining table, not only that, wanted to sleep in your bed, and forcing your children to spy on your daily activities. In relation to this program, the Chinese government has been said publicly that they intended to break the roots and connections and families of the Uyghurs. This policy did not come out of nowhere. After the current party secretary Chen Chang-kuo took office, it emerged that as so-called de-extremification re-education work, which began in 2014, which ramped up the propaganda campaigns targeting Uyghurs as suspected of religious observance. For example, wearing headscarf or growing beard were perceived as a sign of extremism to the Chinese government. The regional and central government have clearly stated that religious extremist thoughts is the cause for separatism. Their solution is to wipe out that particular thought. The Chinese government recently have called Uyghur Islam as a mental illness. And Uyghurs' appreciation of their cultural heritage is a cancerous tumor that should be weeded out, or wiped out with chemicals. The internment camp system is extrajudicial, but the closest thing to legal justification for that to be exists in the Chinese law is what's called de-extremification measures or regulations of 2017. These regulations were the first in the nation to define extremism as, quote, being influenced by religious extremism, expressing views and engaging in behaviors under the influence of extremism, and exaggerated religious concepts which reject and interfere with normal production and life. The Chinese ambassador to the United States recently said that the Chinese government set up these camps to make the Uyghurs a normal human being. But so-called extremism is not clearly defined. The points in the law include 14 manifestations of extremism, such as generalizing the concept of halal. We've been seeing disturbing pictures that the Uyghur cadres and Uyghur people forced to eat pork or sell pork in this Chinese holiday season. I always say this in public. Probably half of the European soccer players today would be perceived as the extremists in the Chinese government's mind because of the beard that they grew for style. And the Uyghur names that has the Islamic concept, Islamic connotation has been banned. And names like Fatima, Mohammed, Yaqub have been banned. One of the most well-known Uyghur soccer players, who used to be known as Mehmet Ali, has changed his name to what's called Chinese modern Uyghur name, who plays for the Chinese Super League. And are we going to see this policy being ended or the practice being ended anytime soon? The trajectory does not look very good. And the Chinese government's behavior shows that they have no intention to stop these practices. The Reuters, back in last November, published a bone-chilling report. It identified through satellite imagery over 80 facilities. Of those 80 facilities, more than 20 of them were surveyed. The expansion rate is almost equivalent of 140 soccer fields. And a similar report was published by Australian think tank ASPE. It surveyed over 28 facilities. The expansion rate is 465% in the less than 2 years of period. And BBC also reported that the Chinese government is in the process of building the largest prison camp just outside of the Uyghurs' major city, the capital city, Urumqi. So it's time for action. We know something horrible is happening to the Uyghurs. The Uyghur people's religion, as I pointed out earlier, is the main target for Chinese government's current policies. Oftentimes, when we look at the practices, people always focus on local government, but the problem lies in the CCP and Xi Jinping's China. Finally, I'd like to point out that the Uyghurs are canaries in a coal mine. It demands international reaction. I cannot imagine that the world stays as quiet as it has been, if someone else or some country other than China locks up more than 10% of its population in internment camps or concentration camps. We would have seen worldwide outcry, responses, and governmental actions that we have not seen. And also, this policy attacking Uyghur religious identity, Uyghurs' ethnic identity, using Uyghurs' life as a laboratory, Uyghurs' homeland as a laboratory, will not stay in that constrained territory. This will have international ramifications. We've already seen Chinese government comfortably publicizing so-called effectiveness of this internment camp system, and the other countries must follow, should consider following to address their Muslim problems. And also they're exporting their advanced technological tools to oppressive regimes, the countries like Venezuela, Pakistan, Yemen, and Sudan, Cambodia, encouraging those authoritarian governments to borrow Chinese technology to keep track of their citizens. Thank you very much.
Yes. Thank you, Walter, and thank you, Heritage, for putting this event together. Today is not only the Chinese New Year, it's also the Tibetan New Year, and that is why also some of my Tibetan colleagues are not here, but I would like to wish everybody, as they say, Loser Tashidele, which is the Happy New Year in Tibetan language. And actually, yesterday, even the Secretary of State wished the Tibetan people and the Himalayan people who have been part of the Tibetan heritage, cultural heritage, a Happy New Year, as a recognition also of the importance of this culture for the United States in general. So this is a new beginning, but what we are hearing today is not really new. The lack of religious freedom in China and in Tibet is at the center of what the Chinese Communist Party has been doing for the last 70 years. This year is the 70th anniversary of the Communist Revolution in China, which coincided also with the invasion of Tibet. And when it comes to Tibet, I think there is something special in the connection between the Tibetan people and religious freedom and spirituality. For historical reason, as you know, the Dalai Lama institution has been the most important institution, even joining spiritual and temporal power for many centuries. And so the clash between the communist ideology and the Tibetan people and Tibetan Buddhism has been very, very fierce from the beginning. With the invasion of Tibet, the Tibetan people saw the destruction of monasteries, the looting of monasteries. During the culture, we talk about 6,000 monasteries which were destroyed at the time. During the Cultural Revolution, the estimate are talking about 1 million people who were killed. But they didn't stop there. In the 90s, after the years of partial liberalization, the Chinese government started this process of patriotic education, which continues to this day, and we see the ramifications through now this Sinicization of religion, which is cutting across, and it's really the new phase of religious freedom of oppression in China. And what we see in East Turkestan is really heartbreaking. It's really heartbreaking when you see that it's part of a systematic approach. We're not talking about some rogue elements within a government structure that are trying to do bad things. It's sometimes happen, when we see a human rights atrocity, sometimes it's the military structures in some countries that, decide to go in an extreme way. the Secretary General of the Xinjiang, the Eastern Turkestan Autonomous Region, used to be the Secretary General of the party in Tibet. And he was sent there in 2009, right after 2008, when they had in Tibet the largest demonstrations ever since the occupation. So after, at the time, 60 years of occupation, the Tibetan people rose up across the Tibetan plateau to protest China's rule. So what does this tell to the Chinese leadership? I mean, their policies are not working. They're not winning over the people. They're not getting the Uyghurs or the Tibetans or even, the Chinese Christians or all those who believe in human rights and democracy to support them. But they continue to pursue that with the idea that you can break, people's mind and people's heart. And Chen Guangguo, who's now in Xinjiang, started to develop these policies on a very, on a smaller scale, but the concept was of total surveillance, establishing a technological grid across Tibet through which basically they have created like neighborhood structures in each city with the mandate to monitor what's happening in the neighborhood and report to the authorities. They have, police stations in monasteries, either inside the monasteries or just outside the monastery. That is common practice in Tibet. And now with the development of technology, naturally, they don't need to have the army in the street all the time. They just need to have some security cameras and a technological system to keep track of what they want to do. And when they will start in 2020 in some parts of China to employ this social credit system, which is something that you can relate to in the United States with social security number, that you gather some information about your financial activities. Actually, the Chinese system will include also your behavior as a citizen as part of your scoring. So what happens if you go to a demonstration? What happens if you file a complaint against the government? What happens if you talk to the diaspora abroad about what's going on in China? So this is really 1984 coming into reality, and I think this is no longer an issue that really is important only for this community, but it's something that the international community has to look at, because we see now with what's happening with Huawei and the controversy about the stealing of intellectual property, but it's not only about losing value or access to market, but it's really empowering an authoritarian government, which is now the second biggest economy in the world, to reshape how international institutions and international values are implemented. When you have Chinese officials running the Interpol, and then he disappears in China, and the Interpol issues a statement saying, we don't know where he is, where are we going? And so I think those are questions that are no longer really relevant for human rights activists or minority community or democracy practitioners, but really for every citizen who care about this issue. But let me say a few words more specifically on Tibetan Buddhism and what's happening. One issue that everybody is aware of is the question of the reincarnation system in Tibetan Buddhism is one of the tenets, and everybody is aware of what happened to the Panchen Lama, who was this young boy who was identified by the Dalai Lama. The Panchen Lama is considered the second most important institution in his Buddhist lineage of the Gelugpa tradition. And when the Dalai Lama recognized this boy at 6 years old, the Chinese authorities decided to kidnap him and his family, and he hasn't been since then. Officially, the Chinese government has been saying, both at the UN and in other places, that they want to respect his privacy, and so he doesn't want to be bothered, but he's fine, and all is good. But not only they kidnapped him and his family, but they appointed their own Panchen Lama. And so what has happened is they groomed this person who's a Tibetan, selected by them, and they have tried to convey to the Tibetan people that these are the good lamas, these are the good teachers that you should follow. The problem is that the Tibetan people don't really respect or don't really, follow someone who's imposed by the government, because this is, it's just not possible. It's just a basic principle of religious freedom. But this is part of a larger plan that they are now moving forward to implement, and they have officially written in their legislation with these new regulations that have been passed more recently over the last few years. Their plan is even to select the next Dalai Lama. And so this is a very, very dangerous road that the Chinese government is taking, because the Dalai Lama doesn't need to be, introduced, but has been someone that has been not only a leader in promoting nonviolence, interreligious dialogue, and compassion all over the world, but has been a key mitigating factor in Tibet, because he has been for decades advocating for negotiations with the Chinese government and for finding a solution that would address the concerns of the Tibetan people regarding their cultural identity, religious freedom, respect for the environment, while respecting the current political system in China. So a very big compromise for the Tibetan side. But if the Chinese government decides to go down that road, this will bring up, unresolved issues within Tibet that goes back to historical situation, and there wouldn't be anybody else who might be able to keep the situation under control. And so this is something that, frankly, goes beyond Tibet. As you know, Tibetan Buddhism has had influence, for many centuries in other countries, including Mongolia, Nepal. Tibetan Buddhism has been also spreading overseas, even in the United States. So every Tibetan Buddhist or someone who cares about religious freedom should really watch these carefully, because this is what the Chinese government believes could work, that they would just select their own people and they would be followed and endorsed by the international community. Now, the United States government has already said, both with the Congress and the administration, both the previous administration and this one, that this will not be accepted. But as we know, the Chinese government wouldn't be deterred by just a statement. There needs to be actions. And I think one action that I think is being discussed at several levels of government, but when you have officials like Chen Guangguo in Xinjiang or others who are overseeing religious freedom policies, I think the time has come to try to look at also at how this Magnitsky legislation has been implemented, which is a legislation that basically authorizes government to sanction certain officials who are found responsible for grave human rights violations. Now, I think that besides the specific cases of human rights violation that sometimes affect one individual or a group of individuals in with tragic consequences, whether it's torture or death, I think what is important is also to look at the architects of the policies that are being implemented on a larger scale and start to say that these policies, if implemented, are going to affect the lives of people. And so these individuals should be individually also targeted with visa sanction, whether it is the freezing of assets or other tools that can be taken. Because when we see that human rights is put not only on the side of bilateral relations among countries, because everything is dominated by security and economy, I think we need to develop a way to enforce human rights principle that goes beyond the political posturing, but sets some standards that have some legal background and legal solid enforcement mechanism behind it. So I think every government, while running the affairs and governing, is in need to find moral clarity. It's not always about the economy. We know these issues are very important, social security and other things. But I think moral clarity is very important for every government. And I hope that religious freedom, is again considered to be an issue that can bring moral clarity, not only to the citizens who deserve it, but also to the governments that are in charge of running our affairs. Thank you.
Thank you, Matteo. It always takes a couple minutes for thoughts to gel in the audience, so please give some consideration. Let me ask just a couple quick questions. Um, um, First to Bob. It seems like many years ago, actually, Christian community in the United States was much more open to engagement with the Chinese because there was some value to it. There was activity, Christian activity going on, churches. There was some hope for the growth of those communities, and the Chinese, even for a time, Chinese Communist Party even seemed to put some value, at least non-religious, non-spiritual, but totally utilitarian value on people of faith. They thought they became good citizens that way. They exercised the right kind of values that supported the state, et cetera. And so Christian communities, along with the business community here, at one point seemed to be some of the most constructive or wanting to be constructive in the relationship. Number one, is my memory of that correct in your opinion? But number two, is there any hope left of engaging the Chinese government in Beijing, the party? Is there any hope of engaging them on these issues constructively?
Yeah, I think, Walter, your memory is right about this sentiment before Xi's era. I remember during the Hu Jintao's time, I remember his key word is harmony, right? 和谐, a harmonious society. And he even gave a very big talk at the Politburo Religious Studies, talking about how to integrate the social values of religious teachings, including Christianity, and even during the Sichuan, Wenchuan earthquake area, actually the largest group of first responders went to the earthquake affected areas, or acknowledged our Christian groups, including actually the unregistered churches. That is acknowledged by the Minzhongbu, the Ministry of Civil Affairs. So at times, there was some kind of, at least on the social value part, there was some hope, at least, the authorities would allow to do charitable work for care for the needy, the poor, the elderly. And but it seems clearly there is a paradigm shift. And make no mistake, the Chinese Christian communities in general is very apolitical or very political passive, I would even say, because number one, of the theological teaching. Number two is given the Communist Party's suppressive policy, they have no room to even on the pulpit or in the public square to talk about any of their comment on Communist Party's policies, human rights records. But Xi, under President Xi, or Emperor Xi, you can call him, since there's no term limit for him anymore, there is a major paradigm shift. I think we all talk about this Sinicization. Of course, he's kind of manipulating this nationalism, patriotism, and very extreme kind of Maoism ideology. I mean, give you example for the last year when the one inspection team from the central government to inspect a church, government-sanctioned church, and they found, there's 10 commandments on the wall, and the inspector basically pointed to the first commandment, said, no, this is incompatible with President Xi. The first commandment was removed. So 10 commandments became 9 commandments. So that is, it's not only to one church now. It's the whole kind of spirit of that directive is going, spread it into other churches. So when the church ceased to be a true church, or the Christian is being forced to even, to so-called, in the name of made the religion compatible with the socialist, the communist doctrine, that really is the red line, right? I mean, no matter how beautiful you describe their social benefit, contribution, when the communist regime, try to change the core of your faith, when the last year was the first year of so-called 5-year plan for the Sinicization of religion or Christianity, the official church already pronounced they're going to retranslation the Bible. So essentially, you expect the Chinese Christians will receive a new version of the Bible compatible with socialism. So you can imagine maybe the in the book of Exodus, the 10 commandments will become 9 commandments. Maybe Moses have to change route, I have to find somewhere else the 10 commandments, and they have to do a new commentary to see that. So that the confrontation is not caused by the believers. I mean, none of really the Chinese believers, really seek confrontation. Like our Uyghur friends, I mean, they are, citizens. They're practicing their faith, and normal, peaceful citizens of that country, and but it was this very repressive paradigm shift, and treat the true authentic faith as a national security threat. I think that is the real cause of this core conflict or problems. Yeah.
So no paintings yet of Xi Jinping with long flowing hair.
Well, they said, they put, in one church they have their cross on the stage, and one side is Xi Jinping's portrait, the other one is Chairman Mao's portrait. Yeah. So the common question asked by the Chinese Christians, who is that saved thief? The robber.
They're doing a giant tanka with Mao Zedong in Tibet. It cost 4 million yuan, like $600,000. This is in Gansu, in a
even the Shaolin,
in a Tibetan Buddhist.
The Shaolin Buddhist monks, they are chanting that, we want to be the great, good monks of Chairman Xi. 成为习近平主席的好和尚。So Xi Jinping became a kind of a semi-reincarnation of that section of the Buddhism for them to learn to be communist, later President Xi's good monks to follow his examples.
Wow. Well, let me open it up to questions right here in this center. We have a microphone over here. Please identify yourself.
My name's...
That's fine. That's good. That's good.
Okay. My name's Nicole Wittersheim. I'm a senior human rights advisor at USAID, which is a development agency under State Department. I'm not an expert by any means in this part of the world and the issues you're raising specifically to China. But I have seen the impact of what they do when they share with Sudan and other countries that I've worked on for the last 20 years. Thank you for sharing very compelling stories and examples of what's happening. I just want to dig a little deeper on what to do about it. The Global Magnitsky Act is a very exciting tool that's being used robustly by the current administration on various human rights crises around the world and individuals. We've seen whole strategies, and I know of them best in Africa, where you do economic sanctions on a government, you do economic sanctions on an individual, you do travel sanctions, you have a whole communication strategy, both for regional entities, and in this case, maybe ASEAN and the UN. I just need to hear, and we have an interest in the US government, as you've noted, with the Vice President and Scott Busby's comments, but I want to hear specifically a little bit more about actions to take and a strategy, because it's clear that we need to do something, but I think you're going to have to be a little bit more prescriptive for us and inside the U.S. government. I mean, USAID, we can't even really work in China. So, yeah, that would be more helpful. Thanks.
Well, let's Nuri and Matteo take a shot at this.
Thank you very much for that excellent question. Yes, it's time for action. Actually, it's past time for action. A number of things that United States and U.S. traditional allies could do. As you know, that the Chinese government, Xi Jinping's China, still cares how they've been portrayed or presented in the international community. Public naming shaming is one of the important tools. We have to call it what it is. We cannot. I think the business as usual method has to stop, and it has not been effective. One and two, this has to be multilateral matter for U.S. and its allies to come together to work. The closed door, quiet diplomacy, not hurting Chinese people's feeling, offending the Chinese government type of approach did not get us anything. So, and also at the same time, the Chinese government has shown that they will respond to international outcry. The watershed movement was the last August at the UN, the Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination made public that the Chinese created no rights zone. Up to 1 million Uyghurs have been locked up, and the Chinese government apparently did not expect this kind of response and been trying, they've been spending. That shows that they still care how they've been perceived in an international community. And also, I think the like-minded government approach, like the one that was effective during the Cold War, bring together the democracies together and come up with a tangible action is one thing. And then U.S. Congress, it currently is considering a legislation, a bill called Uyghur Human Rights Policy Act, introduced by Senator Marco Rubio and Christopher Smith of New Jersey. It's been amazing that how much support that already this particular bill, which is less than a month old, already received. As of yesterday, my count is over 20 senators already signed on board to support this legislation. This specific legislation, one of the main objectives is to force the Chinese government to shut down this modern-day internment camps. It has reporting requirements. It has a requirement to establish special coordinator at the State Department. And also, importantly, it requires law enforcement agencies in our country to defend the rights of the Uyghur Americans and the Chinese citizens who've been Chinese, the individuals with the Chinese origin or has a family members in China been threatened or forced to spy for the Chinese government. Our sovereignty is under threat. The Chinese activities in our country, here in the United States, has been so active, so relentless, aggressive. So this kind of legislative activity will address the issue. And also, I know that Walter does not like to talk about the trade issue, but we have to find a way to speak the language that the Chinese government understand. So bringing this particular issue into the hot topic conversation that the U.S. and China is engaging may yield some outcome.
Well, I agree with the last point. I think bringing it to the table and the process of discussing all the other issues is very important. My only concern is I wouldn't tie it to trade status and tariffs and all the rest. We've got a lot of things already tied up, in fact, on those measures. So I'm not sure how much you can dilute it through that process. But Matteo, in the process of answering this question, because I think it lends itself to it, as Nuri alluded to, what is the status of action in Europe and their approach to any of these issues? You have a very unique history, having served in the Italian Parliament. You have an idea how they think and how the processes work. I'd be very interested to hear that.
I think in general on human rights issues we have over the last 10 years since the 2008 economic crisis that hit our countries, and there was a huge reliance on China that had very important geopolitical implications also in the way especially European countries have been dealing with China. And so there has been a weakening of the focus on human rights issues, which the European Union has championed for a long time. But I must tell you, over the last year and a half, there has been a change, even in Europe. I think that there is, some credit to the approach of the Trump administration to challenge the status quo policy on China, and with various degrees of agreement or disagreement on different topics. But I think the acknowledgement that the rise of China is not going to be peaceful, and it's not going to be something that we can deal as we're dealing with the European Union or with Canada or Mexico. I think this is important. And I think there are opportunities in Europe. In Germany, certainly there is a lot of awareness and worry about how Chinese companies, for example, have been accessing to the European markets, and what are the implications. So from our side, the International Campaign for Tibet, 4 years ago, we started promoting the concept of reciprocity in relations with China, between U.S.-China relations, when it comes to access to Tibet. To tell you briefly, in order to get to Tibet, it's not enough to have a Chinese visa. You need a special permit. And the Chinese government has used this system to block access to Tibet for decades. So diplomats, journalists, NGOs, even normal tourists, if you go to Tibet, you can only go through an organized tour, and you go through a state, sanctioned travel agency. You just don't get a car and go wherever you are. So for them, it's important to control information, what comes in, what comes out, to foster their propaganda. This legislation was just passed, was approved at the end of the year and signed by President Trump, and basically this will allow, and in 90 days now, they will have to present a report to Congress saying what is the level of access for American citizens to Tibet, but it will allow the State Department to block access to the United States for the Chinese officials who are responsible for implementing those policies. To me, beyond Tibet, I think the question of reciprocity, which has been a lot of, there's been a lot of attention on trade issues, but aside from trade issues, there are many other issues on which this principle can be applied. Think about freedom of information. Why is it that Xinhua or other Chinese state media are opening shops everywhere, Washington, other places, and they broadcast in English? And why is it that no American media is allowed to broadcast in Chinese, in China? I mean, it doesn't make sense. China is no longer a developing country. It's a huge market. I mean, there are also economic reasons, but actually, it's a question of fairness. If they want to be part of the international community, you don't agree on the human rights treaties. I mean, but these are bilateral principles that needs to be implemented. Think about academic freedoms. You have the Confucius Institute in all the Chinese, U.S. universities. What are allowed, American university to teach in China? Is there academic freedom? I mean, we hear many stories of scholars who get invited to China and to speak about something, and the day before they're told, yeah, maybe you shouldn't talk about this, and you should find another way. So I think the question of reciprocity, if looked at in a creative way, can offer opportunities also to advance human rights, and it would fit also the agenda of certain, administration like this one, who's not certainly, internationalist, as an approach. It's very much focused on, American interests, but actually it can provide an opportunity and also to bring in other European countries who are struggling with the idea of finding a unified position, which is the biggest problem in European politics at this moment, because with now, the membership at 28, it's almost impossible. Now, my country, just yesterday, for reasons that I won't delve into, but they blocked a common position on Venezuela. And so the European Union now didn't have a position on that. So I think that comes down to China, because China has been also trying to promote an alternative model of development in Europe that they call the 16+1. So they have convened meetings only with a certain part of Europe, basically Eastern Europe and some countries out of the European Union, in which they promote economic support without any discussion on human rights, which is at the center of the dialogue with the European Union as a whole. So there's a lot of, a very dangerous dynamic going on there. But I think especially at the UN, and actually we have joined, I think, also supporting a group of NGOs asking, the U.S. government and others this is the time to start to work on a resolution. The Human Rights Council in Geneva, because with all that is going on, I mean, you can't continue to give a pass to China, even at the place that is being institutionally established to deal with human rights. If you don't do it there, where are you going to do it? So I think that's very important.
Very good. Yeah, the issue of access is so important. I mean, we could have a scholarly debate about what the West knew generally, what was going on in Germany in the 1930s. We could have a debate about that, and there's a lot of conversation already. But the truth is the regime tried to keep the information secret all the way through the war. They restricted access. They restricted information, and so there was always a doubt over exactly what was happening. And especially when I think of the Uyghur issue, we need to know what is happening. We need to know it with some authority in order to act. And as long as the Chinese are able to cast some doubt on the authority that we are discussing this under, they have a little bit of an edge to prevent effective action from being taken.
Say a few words on that front.
Let me get one more question, and maybe you can in response. Yes, right here in the black. Yes.
Christina Alney with the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation. Thank you all for your presentations. We actually were just hosting last week Cardinal Joseph Zen of Hong Kong here in Washington to award him with the Foundation's Truman Reagan Medal of Freedom and for some meetings with administration officials. And one of the things that we discussed during those conversations was the relationship in the Catholic case, the case of the Catholic Church, between the unofficial church in China and the official church in China. And essentially, the bottom line of what Cardinal Zen was saying is that there cannot be unity in the church in China so long as the CCP is in power, because as we've heard from our panel this morning, the CCP has ultimate control, particularly over the official church. And so my question for you is, besides sanctioning officials responsible for the human rights violations in Xinjiang and in Tibet at the highest levels, because that is an important signal that needs to be sent to the CCP, how else can the U.S. and our allies change the decision-making of the CCP? Because as we've heard from Nuri, the playbook of the last 20 years, particularly in our relations with China, has not worked. So that is my question. Thank you.
Let me ask Dr. Yang, would you like to respond to that? How can we change the decision-making process, and then let Bob respond, and he can add his comment.
I think from the point of view of Taiwan, we do think something we have to do because we are so near to this big country. A lot of Taiwanese think if we were a ship, we have to move out of that place. But actually, it reflects the Taiwanese. The thinking is that we have the obligation and the responsibility to do something. So that's why we are going to pass the Refugee Act in Taiwan. I think that is a very important move of Taiwan to do, because if we can do that, we are so near, so we can protect some people. They really want to escape from mainland China. We have a lot of information of this part, and including Uyghur, including Tibet, and including the distance in China. And that is one. And the second thing is I just mentioned that shortwave broadcasting is very effective now because disconnected the internet by the communist China. If we want to send a message in that the people in China to understand what we care, but the way now is so inefficient because it's disconnected. So we have to come back to the traditional short web, middle web, the broadcasting. And in this technology, Taiwan is still keep the very good broadcasting tools in Taiwan. So I think that is another one. This morning we visited VOA. We are talking about the possibility we can cooperate with VOA with us, and just only a small transistor of the Chinese people, even in the rural area in Xinjiang, in Tibetan, it's easy to receive our signal because the Taiwan, the Radio Taiwan International, our coverage is the whole China. We have the 10 different frequency to broadcast into China. So to them, it's very difficult to interfere our signal. So clearly, because I have a program there, sometimes I open live to accept the telephone call. Immediately, just only 1 second, people come in. And I always ask what kind of a tour you listen to our programs, through internet or through transistor. 90% people say through transistor, because that is not possible for them to listen to us and freely through internet. So I think that is a way we have to do, connect the people, let them know we care. That is the first thing we have to do. We just sit here and say lots of things we do care, but they cannot listen to us. And so that is the first thing we have to do. And second thing, if I still thinking that in the future, democratization will be the future of China, but we still keep some good people, the really decent people. Now they are persecuted. So that is not fair for them just let them fight over there. We suggest some people like Liu Xiaopo. I feel so sorry because I used my radio program. I interviewed him before he was arrested. I interviewed him 35 times. And Gao Zisheng, lawyer, I interviewed him more than 50 times. But I think that is even we feel so dangerous of his situation, but still cannot do things right. So if we can do that to range like maybe Bob can respond more to rescue people from there to Taiwan is because it's very near. That is possible. I would like to say the government of Taiwan now is really willing to do things like that, but the Taiwanese president, Tsai Ing-wen, we need to encourage her. Anyway, yeah, it's a way to let Taiwan so different. We must do something. Like today, together with Li Jingyu here, we hear for the help from the United States. But how come we can just only ask the United States to help Taiwanese? We have to do something, help people. Then that's fair. That's fair. So that's why, yeah.
Terrific, thank you. And Bob, in your response also, your question was how we can affect the decision-making in Beijing, right? How do we get at that? And that brings back the issue of whether, again, I don't want to be naive, okay? I just want to get this issue sort of covered. Is there any prospect of talking to them about it in the response to this question about how we impact their decision-making?
Well, I certainly thank you, Christina, for that questions. I totally agree with our panelists. The description of the time for kind of under the table engagement, kind of face-saving diplomacy has come to an end. I think we in the West, at least in the past 20 years after I came to the U.S., I observed we care more about the saving face of the Communist Party than the true suffering people. And honestly, our core values that we cherish most in our free society. And when the foreign ministry spokesperson every time said, "Oh, when you raise this case, you interfere the internal affairs," and then when you have a U.S. congressional resolution, then they condemned it as like greatly hurt the feeling of the Chinese people. So the Chinese people's feeling are so easily to be hurt and so vulnerable. They hijack the Chinese people's feeling. But I think now, I agree also that from the policy level, the multilateral approach. I just came back from Brussels after testifying at the European Parliament hearing. That hearing is like this. It's focused on religious freedom in China. It's my largest turnout hearing. So much, 3 times bigger size. It was a really cross-party hearing with multiple members. This has not been seen in the past. I think there is a consensus already from the policymakers, even I hope in the multilateral kind of institution like the United Nations, Human Rights Council, that should be a time for actions. And I want to really address that in a more kind of a grassroots level. I think for one thing, the Communist Party's tactic was, in a sense, successful. They always called united front, build a united front. I think they successfully planted divisions within China, even among the different minorities and, of course, majorities, or religious, the persecuted religious groups. And for instance, whenever, I'm a Han Chinese, this is my true kind of observation when I was in China, even for quite a long time after I immigrated to the U.S. As a refugee, I got a pretty, I think, open Western education. Whenever this word Uyghur, kind of came to my mind, it was immediately, the image was like very kind of aggressive, violent, threatening. They always want to kill us. When we are in the university, did my graduate studies, when I saw a Uyghur or coming to ours, we have to really hide. That was not only a perception, it's real. So that's the common 90% of the Chinese population, the Han Chinese perception of Uyghur. Is he very threatening, kind of a gentleman? It's kind of so that's why
Going back that long, back to the 80s.
Yeah, very long. Here in the U.S., we started we call the Bearing the Witness campaign, basically by asking our Christian churches in Virginia, other areas, to invite the Uyghur Muslims persecuted or family, who has family members persecuted, to a church to share their stories and to pray over them. And of course, our Uyghur friends, held the largest rally in Adams Center in mosques last week in Seattle by inviting Christians, Han Chinese Christians too, to share their testimony. I think that maybe send a more powerful message, maybe sometimes than a few politicians talk. That to show to the Communist Party that we acknowledge our differences, our faith, our belief, but when it comes to the human dignity, the very core fundamental value of religious freedom, we're united. Our Chinese human rights lawyers, I'm so thankful some of the pioneers who are still in prison, like lawyer Jiang Tianyong. They have, Gao Zhisheng, you mentioned, who already disappeared another 1.5 years. They are the pioneers, basically, when the Uyghurs and Tibetans were persecuted, and they went to their social media and calling the Han Chinese to eat at a Muslim restaurant, a Xinjiang 餐馆, that one symbol, for Han Chinese to sit over there and purposely, to eat a meal in a Muslim restaurant. You can't underestimate the power of that kind of a citizen's power to send to the regime that your division effort will not be successful. I think, I hope our Chinese citizens, inside China, if they kind of hear about this, I hope they can do more and more. Just, Jiang Tianying, Tong Biao, they went to Tibet and they publicly they said, those who are persecuted, we are Christians, we want to be your lawyer. We want to represent you in the court. And I think that kind of citizens' power, the grassroots power, maybe, is more kind of engine of change from inside out. I think, we are sitting on the same panel together is also a great testimony. I hope inside China, my, 80 million, 100 million, depend who takes the number of my fellow Christian brothers, if 10% of them stand up, out of 100 million Christians or 80 million, 10% of them, stand up, said, enough is enough. I, want to stand in solidarity with those who are persecuted for their faith. What a difference it could make, to the Chinese regime. Yeah, so that's something I want to emphasize. And seeing this lady, she and her husband, Taiwanese citizens, they live in a democratic, free environment. Why do they have to care, what's happening over there and end up 5 years imprisonment as a Taiwanese citizen being accused of subversion of Chinese state power and coming to DC, to Europe, to calling not only for her husband's freedom, but for the freedom and dignity of all Chinese citizens. I think that kind of a spirit will unite us. I'm so glad that in Congress we have this bipartisan bill, 20 senators for this Uyghur Human Rights Policy Act, and in the Senate, Speaker Pelosi and Senate Republicans. Maybe that's the only issue they can be united, or to really, because this is not nonpartisan issue after all. So that's my kind of appeal and a call.
Yeah, it's interesting.
Just 1 minute.
Yes, please.
That's a very important question. Three things must happen in order to see. I'm not a political scientist, I'm a lawyer, but strategically thinking, I think we're seeing some change already. One, the public already know what kind of government, what kind of authority, what kind of political party that the West as a business partner dealing with in Beijing. Through the oppression against the Uyghurs, construction of internment camps, locking up more than 10% of the population in 21st century, already showed what kind of government that the West is dealing with in Beijing. Number one. Number two. Number two, I think the Western capitals starting to realize that something has to change in its relationship with China. There's one thing in Washington, strangely enough, unifies people when it comes to international affairs is China. I don't think that we can get into it. And then thirdly, leadership. We don't have a leader yet who would be showing the type of Churchillian leadership or like Ronald Reagan to say, this is not good. This is not the type of relationship. Well, good for us, good for your people, good for the world. So thank God that we're seeing some leaders in the Washington, Mike Pence, Vice President Mike Pence, Senator Rubio, Christopher Smith, has been so public, recognizing the real danger facing the Uyghur people as an example of the people in China facing. So recognition, public education, and leadership, I think what we need right now.
Just one, because I didn't want to leave your question unanswered about the dialogue. There is one example that when the international community, was Tibet movement was, up and running, publicly in the late 90s. In 2000, the U.S. Congress passed legislation, the Tibetan Policy Act, in 2002. Actually, at that point, the Chinese agreed to start some official dialogue with the representatives of the Dalai Lama. I mean, probably was their own tactics, but what I'm trying to say, that if you create enough political support at a multilateral level, even the Chinese government, they need to play by, the rules and politics, and they would engage. It doesn't mean maybe you have what we want to achieve, but I think that's always, we have to keep it in mind that they also adjust to the reality. So you're not dealing with a monolith that is not influenced by external events. So political pressure can work also to bring them to the table and talk more constructively.
That's a really good point about the 2002 Tibet Policy Act. It did encourage dialogue. I hadn't thought about that. My one concern is that the context has changed so much that now you have most policymakers sort of coalescing around the model that the U.S. and China are irreconcilable, that we have differences across the map, and that we're engaged in great power struggle. That's very different than 2002. And so from the Beijing side, I think there's less incentive to engage or to have dialogue, because if it's not this problem, it's another problem. It's the whole of society conflict in some people's minds. So it seems it might be more difficult to move forward with some constructive approach. And it may be that we're out of constructive approaches, and I'm open to that possibility. I only have put it on the table a couple of times because I kind of want to check that proposition to see that we are out. But at any rate, I really wish we could have taken more questions, but the couple we did get were provocative enough that they provoked a good half hour of discussion, I think. So thank you very much for coming out today. Let me just mention one sort of administrative thing. If you are not on our email list, and you've sort of known this event from some other venue, please sign up. There's a list outside that you can sign to make sure you get on that list for future programs. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Don't forget to tweet for today's event, right?
Tweet, yeah.
That's another way to help.